Inherit the Wind is a movie directed by Stanley Kramer from 1960 about a trial against teaching the theory of evolution in schools. This movie was created before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but still accurately portrayed the general mindset that society held during the 1960s. Religion was still very prominent in most American households, and since it was very rare to find people who didn't believe in religion, it's no surprise that anything that was against religion was considered taboo. On top of that, teenagers and young adults around this time were viewed to be more rebellious than their parents were when they were around the same age, which caused a huge generational gap between the two groups. Considering major movements were on the rise and the country was in the midst of the Vietnam War, it is likely that Inherit the Wind contributed to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The late 1950s and early 1960s saw a rise in popularity regarding rock and roll music, which was considered rebellious due to its crude lyrics and strong presence. The parents of this generation never truly had a teenage period because they were accustomed to following orders by their own parents, so there was a lot of confusion as to where this rebellious nature came from, but seeing that rock and roll music was popular with a younger population, it was easy to point the finger at rock and roll music. A lot of their juvenile delinquency was actually just a normal expression of youth, and since the parents of the teens of this generation didn't recognize that, it was hard for them to take their kids seriously. An example of this in Inherit the Wind is when Rachel Brown confesses to her father that she still loves Bert, to which he dismisses the idea of them ever being associated with each other again. He begins to pray aloud while his daughter tries to express her emotions to him, but he continues to ignore her and acts as if she isn't even there. Although Rachel Brown isn't a teen, her opinion still means very little to her father because of the fact that she is going against the norm and defending the man she loves for teaching something other than religion. It's important to keep in mind that this generation also started the hippie movement during the Vietnam War. Hippies were a marginalized group of people known for being associated with hallucinogenic drugs, long hair, irregular appearances, but most importantly, rejecting what are known as conventional values. Their peaceful protests gained national attention, and with the footage from Vietnam coming out, more and more people became passionate about the movement. As more US citizens were being drafted and sent to Vietnam, more people began to protest. The war would continue, but they would never give up the fight.
In order to fully understand the significance of Inherit the Wind, it is important to know the historical context surrounding the film. In 1917, the Russian Revolution began, and was surprisingly successful for the Soviet rebels. As such, leftist political ideologies rooted in Marxism started to rise in popularity. Americans began to fear the radicalization of leftist groups in the United States, beginning the First Red Scare, a period of widespread concern regarding the rise of anarchism and communism. The First Red Scare was pretty inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but it did have its influences, largely in blurring the lines between church and state, and by establishing a widespread stigma against leftism in the United States. Marxism is rooted in the belief that atheism is ideal for society and necessary for communism, Karl Marx himself going as far as to say, quote, "Religion is the opium of the people. It is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of our soulless conditions." In response, many U.S. legislatures enacted bills that allowed, and in some cases mandated, the teaching of Christianity in schools. One of these was Tennessee's Butler Act, which John T. Scopes was accused of violating in 1925 upon teaching the theory of evolution to his high school students. This led to the Scopes monkey trial, which was depicted in Inherit the Wind. After World War II, the Soviet Union became a global superpower and the Cold War began, leading to the Second Red Scare. The Second Red Scare was much more catastrophic for the United States and led to the rise of McCarthyism, which was the practice of conducting witch hunts to find treasonous individuals. Many politicians, in particular Joseph McCarthy, for whom the practices of the time were named after, took advantage of the hysteria to falsely accuse and indict political opponents of being communists, and therefore treasonous, often leading to lengthy trials and false incarceration. Although it was dangerous to speak out against these practices during the McCarthy era, following his censure in 1954, people started to chill out, and the original screenplay for Inherit the Wind was written, incorporating and criticizing the contemporary issues of McCarthyism, witch hunts, and mob mentality, while still shedding light on the importance of the separation of a church and state, especially when it comes to public education.
Inherit the Wind was made 4 years before the Civil Rights Act and near the peak of the Civil Rights Movement, and rather than race, the movie speaks on religion. But both the movie and the movement had one thing in common, and that's the fight for education. Inherit the Wind had the message of freedom of thought and to not conform to old ideas. Every child deserves a first-class education without damaging censorship and regardless of race. And those who care to teach and teach with freedom of thought should not be imprisoned, like the character of Bertram Cates within the movie. The fight for education is very important. Thanks to the Civil Rights Movement, people of color could go to the same school as white students. After Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, they desegregated schools and later refined it to fight against discrimination with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Movement was generally a fight for equality, and it's still a fight we face today.
Many art movements were happening during the 1960s, including pop art, optical art, minimalism, conceptual art, performance art, feminist art, and a rise in popularity of film and photography. Under this time, voices began to express themselves and their opinions much more easily through their art. Photography and film became a staple at this period, and proved itself effective in giving directors and the people the power to showcase issues and relay messages America really needed to hear. Stanley Kramer was known for being one of the few producers and directors to tackle such issues during the 50s and 60s. He made most of Hollywood's famous message films and was considered a liberal movie icon. He liked using symbolisms in films, for example, having Inherit the Wind's courtroom be a visual representation of the relentless heat thrown on the defendant by making it 97 degrees during production, and having the actors flap fans in every courtroom scene. The reaction from the audience back then were mainly positive, complimenting the acting and the direction the movie was going after. However, even with all the praise, it was still considered hard to sell to an average moviegoer. Films like these were widely avoided, whether they were too hard to produce or just because of the fear of the audience's reaction. The fear was rational because even though the critics liked Inherit the Wind, the movie still lost $1.7 million during the initial release. The growth of these art forms empowered artists around America and influenced others in a special way that still does today. This era was one of the many significant moments to how we voice our opinions now, but also how we use it and view art today.